Hey Warriors, this video is for U.S. government and we'll be talking about another Supreme Court case. So if you'll pull out one of your note-taking pages for those Supreme Court cases, at the top of the page where there are spaces provided for the litigants, you want to write Kyllo versus the United States. Kyllo is spelled K-Y-L-L-O and it's a person's last name. The United States, of course, is the United States of America. This case starts with the commission of a crime in 1992 in the state of Oregon. The Supreme Court doesn't pick up this case and re-examine it and give their decision until the year 2001. So it's 9 years between the commission of the crime and the Supreme Court's decision. As far as historical context is concerned, the crime was committed in the state of Oregon, so it's important to know that in the state of Oregon in 1992, marijuana was illegal. Marijuana and the growing of marijuana is something that happens in this case. Marijuana wasn't legalized medicinally in Oregon until 1998, and it wasn't legalized for recreational purposes until 2014. So in 1992, growing, possessing, selling, using marijuana, all illegal in the state of Oregon. The second piece of historical context is the use of a thermal imaging device. A thermal imaging device is a relatively new piece of technology that law enforcement was beginning to use in the early 90s. And this, of course, is a piece of equipment that is able to sense hotspots inside of a building or a room or a house. And those hotspots sometimes could be created by a person. Our core temperature is 98.6 degrees, so that's hot. It'll show up on film footage. It could be also lamps or lights or any kind of household appliance that is producing heat. And so the thermal imaging device, being kind of new on the scene as a new tool, a new technological tool being used by law enforcement and police departments, that's part of our context as well. As far as constitutional issues that are at stake, this is a Fourth Amendment case. The Fourth Amendment reads as follows: the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So, this is the Fourth Amendment. It talks about the process of obtaining a warrant. It talks about privacy rights. It talks about a person's right to have their own stuff, to be able to keep it secure against someone coming in their home and searching it, or someone coming in their home and seizing their things or taking their things away. So we know probably from our television and movie watching experiences about the Fourth Amendment, a warrant is needed to enter a person's home to search it. And that warrant is to be signed by a judge because probable cause has been determined beforehand. And that warrant will say that you get to go into a particular residence and look for a particular thing. If police or law enforcement go into a home with a warrant and they're searching for illegal weapons, and instead they find illegal drugs, they cannot take the illegal drugs. They were there to look for weapons. So they had to go back and get another warrant. Okay? So this process, again, may be something we're familiar with, hopefully just from watching television. But this is what this case is about: the Fourth Amendment, warrants, searches, and seizures. Okay, let's look at the players involved in this story. First, we have Danny Kyllo. Danny Kyllo is a resident of the state of Oregon. We already talked about Oregon and its marijuana laws. And Danny Kyllo, you can write this down, he's just a guy with a green thumb, okay? I don't know if you've heard the expression before, he has a green thumb. What it means is that he or she can grow things really well. You may know somebody that if you give them a plant, the plant will be dead in 2 days. They can't grow anything, they can't keep anything alive. But then there are other people who can seemingly grow things out of air. All right, Danny Kyllo has a green thumb. He's good at growing stuff. And you may already have suspected, because of our discussion of marijuana laws and thermal imaging devices, that Danny Kyllo is particularly good at growing marijuana. So this is the beginning of his problem. The other player or group of players in this story is the United States Department of Interior. These are federal agents, and they suspect that Danny Kyllo is growing marijuana in his apartment. He lived in a triplex, which is one building with 3 apartments in it. And so he lived in a little triplex, and these Department of Interior federal agents suspected that he was growing and selling, supplying marijuana, but they couldn't get enough evidence on him to be able to get into his home and look for that marijuana. They had in fact tried to look at his power bills, reasoning that if he was growing a lot of little marijuana plants, they were all probably under lamps and his power bill would be a lot higher. But as much as his power bill was high, there are a lot of reasons why your electricity bill could be high. You know, maybe you have a sauna and you run the sauna and hot tub all the time. Maybe you leave the lights on when you leave a room. Maybe you're one of those people that falls asleep in front of the TV and the TV's on 24 hours a day. Lots of reasons why your electricity bill could be high, besides that you have little lamps growing marijuana plants in your house. So these federal agents were a little bit frustrated. They were a little bit exasperated. And so they decided that they would use a thermal imaging device. They set this device up away from Danny Kyllo's home, and they pointed it toward his home, and they saw these hot spots, okay? On surveillance film from a thermal imaging device, these will show up yellow, sometimes red, where there are concentrations of heat. And they found all these little hot spots all throughout his apartment. Of course, they reasoned that these were the lamps under which marijuana plants were being grown. So they entered his home and looked. And sure enough, Danny Kyllo had 100 pot plants in his house. So Danny's in big trouble for growing that amount of weed in his house. And so after he goes to trial and is convicted, he appeals his case saying that his Fourth Amendment rights had been violated, that the process through which law enforcement entered his home was unconstitutional. So this, to make a long story short, this case eventually ends up in the hands of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has to ask themselves this question: does the use of a thermal imaging device to see, in this case, what were suspected to be little lamps in his house, does the use of a thermal imaging device violate Danny Kyllo's Fourth Amendment rights? Okay, so on to the court's decision. This was a close one. It was a 5-4 vote. And the 5 in the majority agreed with Danny Kyllo. They said that the use of a thermal imaging device was a violation of his Fourth Amendment rights if it were used without a warrant. And so let's look at that majority opinion written by Justice Antonin Scalia. Scalia says the government uses a device that is not in general public use. Thermal imaging devices were not easy to get a hold of. Law enforcement had them kind of before regular people did. A device that is not in general public use to explore details of the home that would have been previously unknowable without physical intrusion. Without a warrant, this is unreasonable, meaning an unreasonable search. So Scalia says, look, they found out information that was inside the home through technology that they wouldn't have been able to know otherwise unless they intruded or unless they entered the building. And that was a violation of Kyllo's Fourth Amendment rights. Let's look at the dissenting opinion now. The dissenting opinion, representing those 4 dissenting judges, was written by Justice John Paul Stevens. And Stevens says 2 things. Observations were made with a fairly primitive thermal imager that gathered data exposed on the outside of Kyllo's home, but did not invade any constitutionally protected interest in privacy. So let's look at the second thing he says first. He says that the information was gathered on the outside of Kyllo's home, which, yes, it was. The device was set up a distance from the home, but the information that it gathered was information from inside the home. So this feels like kind of a weak argument. Now let's look at the first thing that Justice John Paul Stevens said. He said, look, the government was using a pretty cheap device. It was just a primitive, kind of simple thermal imaging device. But the thermal imaging device still worked, didn't it? Think about it this way. Let's say you're a hunter and it's deer season and you go out hunting deer and you like to take your grandfather's old musket with you, your great-great-grandfather's old musket. It's a single-shot musket. You have to load the ball and load the powder and everything, and you take that gun. It's kind of a sketchy situation. You never know where the musket ball is going to go, but you lay down in the woods and you hide. A deer comes up, you shoot the deer, and you kill it. Okay? Now, let's say a couple weeks go by, Christmas comes and goes. For Christmas, you get a new rifle. You take that brand new rifle right out of the box, all cleaned and oiled. You're certain it's going to work beautifully. You take that out in the woods. You lie down in the woods. You wait for a deer to come. The deer comes, you shoot it, and it dies. Does that first deer care that the rifle you used was rather primitive at the time you killed it? No. It worked. It wasn't as nice and shiny and well-oiled and reliable as the new rifle you have, but that old primitive rifle got the job done. And this primitive thermal imaging device got the job done too. So again, this dissenting argument feels a little bit weak. But those were the arguments that were made. Finally, the ongoing impact of this Supreme Court decision on society. This is a case that is an example of the challenge that sometimes the Supreme Court faces when they take the Constitution, a document that was largely written in the end of the 18th century, the late 1700s, and they have to apply those laws and principles to a world that is changing at a rapid pace, especially in terms of technology. And so when you think about privacy and when you think about persons' rights to privacy and persons' rights to their belongings and their property, this becomes much more complicated in a technological age. When we think about thermal imaging devices, as this case suggests to us, when we think about cell phones or computers, which we'll look at in the next Supreme Court case, it becomes a complicated issue. So this is the Supreme Court saying, look, we are committed to kind of interpreting the Constitution so it applies to 20th century and 21st century circumstances. And so as I said, we'll look at another one of these cases the next time, and I will see you then.